Welcome everyone to another edition of the NatCon Australia podcast. I'm delighted today to welcome Timothy J. Lynch, who is a professor of political science at the University of Melbourne. He writes on contemporary America and its intersections with Australian life. An award-winning writer, Lynch's latest book is In the Shadow of the Cold War, American Foreign Policy from George Bush Sr. to Donald Trump. Timothy holds a PhD in political science from Boston College, US, and was twice awarded a Fulbright scholarship. In 2022, he lived in Wyoming, America's reddest state. He is a citizen of Australia and Great Britain and lives in rural Victoria. Welcome again, Timothy. Thanks very much. I really do appreciate you making time. As we're discussing just before I got on, what originally sparked my interest in having a chat with you was an article you wrote for The Australian a couple of weeks back, 14th of August 2024, entitled "Win or Lose, Vance has sparked a revolution across conservatism." And I thought it touched on some sort of NatCon related themes. And I just thought it'd be worth maybe you just summarizing the argument that you're making in that piece.
Yes, Dan, great to be here. My argument is that the usual claim that's made of Donald Trump is that he doesn't reflect a shift in conservative politics beyond himself. So when he eventually leaves the stage by whatever means, the Republicans will revert to type. So the disruption that he's caused will be stilled, and they'll go back to a kind of Bush dynasty style of politics. And the argument I explored in the piece on Vance is that the nomination of Vance actually queries that optimistic claim on behalf of a displaced old GOP. What Vance is a very profound illustration of is how far republicanism has shifted towards a working class set of interests, that it's now for conservative politicians, Republican politicians, to start playing on the cultural front, not simply on an economic front, and hoping culture and education, particularly higher education, will take care of itself. Vance is symbolic, I think, of what Christopher Rufo, perhaps we'll get to him at some point, claims is the coming counter-revolution against the seizure of the institutions by the left. Now, Trump, I don't think is sensitive to this. I don't think he picked Vance with much care and attention at all, really, and probably regrets the decision because it doesn't win him more votes. But inadvertently, I think what Trump has done is actually given us an indication of what his long-term legacy will be after he is no longer on the stage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are things that I would quibble with in the piece, but I think it's very rare to find in Australia people that have actually kind of understood at a deeper level that there has been a genuine change in the governing philosophy, animating philosophy of the Republican Party, and indeed at a bipartisan level in the United States since 2016 after Trump's surprise victory. Typically, the columnists in the Australian use adjectives to describe, Trump. He's transactional. That's the one that's always used. Populist, unpredictable, revolutionary, narcissist. And people are captivated by the story of J.D. Vance, or the antics of Donald Trump. But they haven't fully, at least in Australia, haven't fully appreciated that, at least in my view, like J.D. Vance is not so much of a revolution, and I know you don't choose the title to your pieces, but he's more of a solidification or of a consolidation of a more deeper, coherent intellectual framework of Trumpianism, or the new Republican, new conservatism. That's the point you're really making?
Yes, I think you put that point well down. That Trump forged ahead with a mass movement, and it was the intellectuals on the right that followed, probably a little too late, but have eventually caught up and have decided to use what Trump has wrought to initiate, well, we can call it a revolution or a counter-revolution, but certainly the solidification, your words, good one, of intellectual trends that Trump has set in place, but wouldn't probably recognize himself. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Perhaps we'll get to questions of how far this is applicable to Australia and across the West more generally. And I see obvious indications that of applicability, as well as significant arguments against that claim.
Okay. Well, what? Oh, well, okay. Let me just take a few little points on the article that I didn't entirely agree with. I mean, you're essentially making the claim that Vance is different, and I know you can only say so much in a short, 850-word opinion piece, but you were saying that foreign policy, he's different to the George W. Bush view. 100% agree with that. You said on trade, he's also different to the previous mainstream republicanism, what people would have believed in, prior to 2016. And then you said he's different because of, and this is an area which I do kind of quibble with. I mean, he said he's much more engaged in the social wars, and unlike Reagan and I think he said Reagan was agnostic on the issue of abortion. And I don't know. I would have thought like the traditional Reaganism was this famous three-legged stool, right? Strong on defense, strong on social conservatism, and strong on economic liberalism. I mean, does the social was that the point you're making, or was it slightly different to the one?
No, I think that's a good summary, and I'm looking forward to sparring with you. I'm just not saying what your disagreement, where I disagree with that claim there. I think J.D. Vance's key opponent, rather ironically, is not the Democrats. It's the Wall Street Journal. It's that traditional it's the free trade republicanism that's grounded in Reaganism. Reagan, of course, initiates this movement towards globalization, which produces the dislocation which gives us J.D. Vance in the first place. But I think Vance's position, certainly on foreign policy, are a reversion back to a 30s style isolationism. On social issues, his anti-abortionism, his pro-life position, I think far exceeds any position that Ronald Reagan took on this issue. And Ronald Reagan, I think, was sanguine about the universities. I don't think he ever thought about higher education as a political front, a front in a wider war. The operating assumption of the Reagan Republicans was that they had won the argument. The Cold War had gone their way. The economic argument had been won by the forces of the right, and the culture would follow. Vance is a very good indication of having that assumption being wrong, being misplaced. That the left, who couldn't win the economic argument, ironically, because Marxism begins in its economic determinism, they decide to realize power through culture, through the institutions. And it's taken Republicans 40 years, captured in the vice presidential nomination of J.D. Vance, to actually take that threat seriously.
Yeah, I mean, you could trace some willingness to engage in cultural issues back to, even Nixon, right, and Reagan. But I do take your point that this particular type of engagement with the tertiary thought leaders or media thought leaders and is something that the Republican, at least the mainstream Republicans, have been slow to take on. I guess the point what I was making is Reagan, yes, he was the governor of California and he was quite socially liberal at that stage, no fault divorce, and I think first, quite liberal on abortion then. But by the time he
himself, of course, like Trump.
That's right. But by the time he was in the 80s, he was writing, he was quite pro-life, at least ostensibly, and was writing books like he wrote pamphlets, Abortion and the Conscience of the Nation. I mean, that kind of moral majority type conservatism, I think, is not quite the same as the culture war stuff in a way. I mean, or it's a subsection of it, and there's criticism of both JD Vance and Donald Trump for not being as kind of staunchly pro-life as the traditional Republicans were, at least post-Reagan. But anyway, that's a sort of a side issue. The other point that wasn't raised in the article, which I think is more central to the new politics, is immigration, right? It wasn't in that article. And JD Vance is, and I know you can't mention everything, but JD Vance is Donald Trump was great soundbite, build the wall, and all the rest of it. Although he didn't do quite as build as much of it as he should have. But JD Vance is much more of sort of a thinking man's kind of Trump, and understands the sort of not his critique and support for that position is not based out of animus or any kind of willing to grab the headlines, but just thoughtful way consideration about what a nation is, what's required, the limits of assimilation, even though it's possible of different people. But I appreciate you can't mention everything, but you'd accept, right, that immigration is also part of the new. It's very different to. There's a YouTube video with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush in Texas back in the 80s in their sort of primaries, I think. And some guy asked them from Texas, do you support public schools paying for illegal immigrants? And both of them are very open bordery. We've got to be big-hearted and warm and quite say family values don't stop at the Rio Grande, but that's the sort of spirit. Sorry to ramble, but the immigration is also, I think.
Yes, that's not a ramble at all. That's very important, I think. I mean, would you agree then, Dan, that one of the great transpositions between left and right in the US is over the issue of immigration? That immigration now is embraced by the left. 30, 40 years ago, it was seen as the negation of wages for working class Americans, whereas now the left see it as students for their woke campuses, and I caricature some, and as cheap labor for their gardens and kitchens, whereas the right have inverted that position and now see immigration as of course a threat to the national project itself. But again, I see echoes of this debate, particularly in the recent British general election, where immigration has assumed central political importance. And Australia, I'm sure we'll get to that more fully. Australia began with a Stop the Boats campaign in 1788, and we're still in a Stop the Boats campaign, but the position is inverted. So immigration seems to me to be a very important front in this realignment of politics across the Western democracies.
Yeah, I discussed on another podcast why we haven't experienced in Australia to date look. There are people I've met in the UK like Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger who are much more. They call themselves the new conservatives or new right, although that's always been a term people have taken on in different eras. But they're much more aligned to the type of JD Vance thinking, although a minority in the UK. There hasn't been the same sort of change here. The opinion pages of the Australian, by and large, are still Hawke, Keating, Howard era is the standard to which we should all be aspiring, and no real reflection on trade. No real reflection. Certainly not on mass immigration. We've been much more successful than the United States and the UK on stopping the boats, illegal immigration, but no real thoughtful stuff apart from, caps on university students at the margins. And no real, I think, reflection, at least expressed through, DFAT and these places, on where we might have gone wrong over the last 30 years in terms of all these foreign interventions, whereas that I feel like has occurred at different, certainly in the United States and even to a certain extent in the UK, right?
Yeah. Oh, I think the sense of crisis that Americans have lived with over the last 20 plus years since 9/11 has no obvious analog in the Australian experience. The last 20 years have been just wonderful for our real estate prices, our resource exports, and we've done Chinese student numbers, the whole international student market, extraordinary, not good luck, but extraordinary advantage Australia has enjoyed. Whilst in the United States, we had 9/11, we had the botched wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we had the global financial crisis. One would expect, would they not, that to bring about profound political change in a way we just don't have. I think the key comparison here to illustrate this is Pauline Hanson and Donald Trump. Trump became a president, potentially a two-term president, though I've got doubts about that, on the back of dislocation, cultural alienation, failed war, economic recession. And Pauline Trump can trade on some of these issues, but in much smaller, much more meager fashion, and she remains a peripheral politician. So I think it's not just a matter of scale. America's big and Australia is small to middling. It's the experience of national failure. We just don't have that. We create our own sense of national failure and shame through dispossession and in welcomes to country, etc., The Voice. And they all, to me, speak to the fundamental success story that this nation represents, in contradistinction to the great turmoil America has experienced over the last few decades.
Yeah, I mean, a key, an obvious one, economically speaking, is that we have a current account surplus with China, a big one, whereas the Americans and the Europeans do not. And you like to think, well, what would that mean if we didn't? What would the attitude to China be like? And when Pauline Hanson did have that success in 1996, that was pre-mining boom. That was so we had been, and her issues then were in an area, Oxley, not too far from where I'm from. I mean, I mean, in a city, Brisbane, but Oxley's not too far away. Had been deindustrialized, right? It was as at the time as unlikely. Well, it was like Trump winning Michigan and Wisconsin and in 2016, similar type of issues. And similar kind of, certainly there was a disdain from large parts of the population, and even amongst conservative circles, there was less sort of real engagement with the, does trade policy really make sense? But more of a kind of sympathetic, at best. Yes, we understand your plight, but it's the way of the future. Ho hum, and eventually you'll come to see things like we do. What I mean, I don't want to quickly race into it, but what do you think in the event, and you predicted Trump will not win because of JD Vance, I think, that article, which is always very brave, because you never know. I always find with the United States,
no,
who really knows, right? I don't really know the top issues in Melbourne today, let alone the top issues in Pittsburgh. But the bipartisanship on foreign policy has certainly changed, right? There'll be less, far less likelihood, you would think, of the United States trying to remake the Middle East as it was previously trying to do. I mean, do you think, or do you think that won't necessarily hold? There could be some big event which again riles passions and gets people thinking that that's the only way forward.
Yes, I think if you're looking for points of convergence and bipartisanship in the US today, I think I'd put foreign policy up there. That despite some differences of style, the actual substance of the foreign policy approach of both sides is much more similar than different. And I'd extend this thesis backwards since the end of the Cold War. But if you looked at the approach to China, Biden, and one would assume Harris, is more likely to tweak what Trump put in place I think the foreign policy minimalism that Vance has articulated, I think, quite disconcertingly, if you're sitting in Berlin or Paris, is one that Biden has made operational. The support for Ukraine is not gung-ho. It's very circumscribed. It's about giving to Kyiv enough, as I argue in the piece, enough to keep it fighting, but not enough in terms of supply. Plenty of moral support. Biden and Democrats can do that all day long. But in terms of F-16, and certainly not troops on the ground, the supply is enough to keep it in the fight, but rendering it incapable of winning. I don't think you get a huge shift under a Republican dispensation. So I think the battle is internal. The battle's red and blue states. The battle is classrooms. It's not the projection of American power overseas. We're in one of those moments which are not uncommon across American history of retrenchment and withdrawal, which are always, as a matter of historical record, replaced eventually by periods of interventionism and war. We're just waiting for that recurrence for that pattern to reassert itself. But I think bipartisanship still resides in foreign policy.
How would you describe then the current ideological disposition of American foreign policy today? There was an article, a neat article I was just remembering was I was flicking through it, by Charles Krauthammer in 2004, when he charted very briefly sort of four strains in his view, like isolationism, a liberal internationalism, realism, and what he called democratic globalism. We probably would say neoconservatism, and how they have all flowed through at different stages. So you'd say, using his terminology, we've had the kind of democratic globalism, neoconservative type of foreign policy of the last 20 plus years, and now, does it automatically follow that we go back to a retrenchment, or does events intervene and require America to again go abroad to shore up its position or what have?
Yes, of course, past performance is no guarantee of future returns, but all we've got is American history, just over 24 decades of it, in which there's a fairly clear pattern of America realizing its interests through war, and then retrenching and trying to realize its interests through alliance making, internationalism, and or a renewed isolationism. So who knows what the great fault lines will be? I think on some of the biggest ones, like the rise of China, you've got far more commonality across the two sides than you've got difference. I think there's clearly a difference of emphasis when it comes to alliance making. Now, I'd point out that Trump, though he put the shits up NATO, didn't withdraw. In fact, he's probably a reason that NATO became a bit more effective when it had to meet Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He used alliances in not dissimilar. I mean, he dissed them, but he still used them. And of course, Biden and Harris have done the same. America still sits atop the world's strongest, both in military and economic terms, alliances in world history. And I don't think the realism of the most profound Republican isolationist would walk away from those. I think I miss Krauthammer profoundly, a guy that was very important to shaping my thinking about US foreign policy and the US generally. And I think he's got it basically right, that you've got four different traditions, persuasions. Walter Russell Mead makes a similar, very important claim about this. And they, over time, tend to complement each other. We see discord and conflict across these, but over the long term, it means foreign policy gets properly vetted. It doesn't guarantee success, but it means the problems of democracy for foreign policy are much less severe than the problems of autocracy for Russia's foreign policy, for example, or indeed for China's. Sorry, that's wandered a long way around your very good question.
No. Where do you stand? I think you reviewed one of his books, but he was in Australia recently. Certainly, become a bit of a rock star in foreign policy circles. John Mearsheimer. Where do you stand? And he's characterized as sort of an arch realist, and I think his actual sort of he characterizes himself, I think, as an offensive, proponent of offensive realism.
Yeah.
And so, where do you differ with him if you're really going to get into the academic Olsci talk? We're not in terms of particular, well, both in terms of particular kind of policy prescriptions at the moment, but also just general analytical framework for how you see the world.
I'm a recovering realist. My name is Tim Lynch, and I'm a recovering realist. And what does that mean? It means that I am very taken, particularly with John Mearsheimer's understanding of global politics, international relations, as a struggle between powers over how they realize their interests and their security. But I part company from him when it comes to explaining American behavior. He's very good, without getting into the weeds of international relations theory, he's a very good proponent of neo-realism without actually claiming properly that mantle. And neo-realists or structural realists say that conflict, the competition for power, is foundational to the state system, to the structure. So you can be whatever kind of state you want, from the most green and pacifistic to the most belligerent. You'll still have to play by the same rules. You'll have to look out for your security. You'll have to do deals with states you find unpleasant. And if you don't, the system will find you out. What it means, I've spent my professional adult life studying the United States, and year after year, decade after decade of doing that suggests to me that structure is really important, like Mearsheimer for that approach, but it doesn't capture what America does. To understand America, you've got to look inside the box, which Mearsheimer says you just don't have to do. So he gets into these. The theory is so powerful for him, and he's made a ton of money and influence peddling the theory. I mean, that makes it sound like I'm disparaging him, and I don't mean to. I think he's a considerable thinker and intellectual. But it means simplifying the complex. It means ignoring American history. It means ignoring US federalism, the frontier, or everything about the US that makes it different and interesting. Becomes secondary. It's just about measuring its power. And the more power a state has, the more it will do what all states with great power do, and America doesn't. While we're on our Mearsheimer segment, I think the redundancies of this approach were exposed when he took a detour with Stephen Walt in this really problematic book, The Israel Lobby, which again has given him a position of prominence in the debate post October the 7th he probably doesn't deserve. But then he threw off all the theoretical certainties of structure and said it's the Jews, or I caricature, it's Israel. Look inside Israel as this ethnocentric state, this apartheid state, and you'll understand why US policy towards the Middle East has been corrupted. And those two things are not reconcilable. It's either structure, which conditions all states to behave in broadly similar ways in order to survive, or it's about all the difficult tasks of understanding the behavior, individual histories, traditions of particular states. And he can't have it both ways.
Yeah, I think I've heard him try to rationalize that by saying that international relations theory doesn't apply to the Israel-Palestinian Gaza conflict because it's an internal. It's like his views on like the American Civil War. That's an internal domestic or ethnic internal dispute rather than the realist view where you look at the nation and its power, and it's a bowling ball, and you don't look at its internals at all. I also, I find him convincing in some areas and less convincing, like in that area in others. But he's not to be dismissed as a an anti-Semite or some sort of just hard ass for the sake of being a hard ass. He clearly has a very thoughtful and his books are worth engaging with, right? Even if you disagree.
Oh, he's unavoidable, and I make sure all my students get a full dose of Mearsheimer, and it's usually from a position on my part, of great deference. I mean, I try and forget the Israel lobby departure. I always read Mearsheimer, and he's very helpful in framing the Ukraine war. I don't go all the way with his account, but he's absolutely crucial. The irony of Mearsheimer, of course, which he would observe and is observed about him, is that he is the product of American liberalism. The thing he disavows, that liberal internationalism, which explains much of America's emphasis of the last 70 years, foreign policy emphasis of the last 70 years, has produced the greatest realist thinker who actually says it's all hooey.
Yeah, I think Samuel J. Huntington as well described himself as a liberal, but he also had quite he became his analysis of the nation state and what makes it up is a very kind of hard hitting, which doesn't always. John Mearsheimer is a good antidote to sort of foreign policy is just pure emotionalism, which can be the case in Australia, and people get worked up, and it's like no, just have a cup of tea and lie down and think about what actually this means. And over the last 30 years, it wasn't easy to be on the side of we shouldn't do anything here, we shouldn't do anything there, because can't you see the suffering of this, that, and the other? I plead guilty to being caught up in it all, but those guys, those voices were cautioning, just think this one through. You can't remake the world. There's an element of utopianism to this sort of democratic globalism, and you would say at the moment, although who knows, maybe the wheel will turn again, that they've sort of had the better side of the argument in many cases. We don't have just to ask you, because we don't have, there's different schools in American foreign policy and the rest of it. We don't in Australia really have the ability to be isolationist or being engaged, and we tag along with America, but in our own right, we can't be democratic globally and changing the world. What should Australia do? Let's assume Trump and Vance get elected, and that there is a much more realist foreign policy that's adopted by them. How should we play that in the 4 or 8 years following?
Oh, I don't think it's simple, but I think you would see a reworking of what worked more for Australia than it didn't in the first Trump administration. I think you make yourself, if you're Albanese, you say to Trump, I am this nation, Australia, is crucial in the containment of China. We want free and fair trade with the People's Republic, but we will be the first to alert you when they start playing silly buggers. So you appeal to Trump's self-interest, America's self-interest, his sense of transactionalism. You don't do the blood sacrifice line. I don't think that works as well with a Donald Trump. He's not good on military sacrifice. He's got no feel for veterans. I mean, it really is one of the great weaknesses in his character. And yet that's been one of the most important bases of the special relationship between Canberra and Washington. Where you go, we have gone and will continue to do so. I think that matters less. What matters more is being the key ally in the region, in a region that's seeking to contain China. I don't think there are paroxysms of doubt over how to deal with a second Trump term. In fact, in some ways, it might be more more straightforward than a Harris-Walz term. Trump is a very good reader of state interests, and he understands that Australia's relationship to China is driven by greed and fear. And I don't think Australia needs necessarily to disavow that claim. America and Australia have profound economic interests in maintaining China's productive capacities, but also great fears over how it uses its economy and how it will fund its military and the military ambitions it has in the region. That will tie the two together. But again, to come back to my bipartisan claim here, I don't think you would get a significant shift in the Australian approach to Washington under a Democratic administration. I mean, clearly a change of personnel and style, but I think in terms of substance, much more continuity.
You mentioned trade, right? I mean, this is one where there is a big divide between Australia and the United States. Robert Lighthizer, Trump's US trade representative, and potentially his new US trade representative, is not a guy to be dismissed. He's a very thoughtful guy. He understands the WTO. He understands trade structures and legislation. He was responsible for the refashioning of NAFTA. Is it really sustainable for Australia to effectively have a free trade arrangement with China, where 100% of manufactured goods from China come in duty free, where the US does not? It has significant tariffs on a range of products from China. It's going to boost, which have been maintained. Trump introduced them, have been maintained in the Biden administration, are going to be boosted further, purportedly under the new Trump regime, in addition to a wide-ranging, across the board, 10% at least, tariff wall being introduced into the United States. How can Australia simply say, okay, we're going to continue with containment and be your friend, and but we have a diametrically opposed trade policy to the one that you have with China? Is that going to be really sustainable?
Well, I suppose this is a question of where realism intrudes in the perception of states' interests. I think the United States is well aware that Australia is not a mini version of America, that its dependence on its trade with China is much more profound than America's, and that Australia, like many other countries, will have to part company on this tariff philosophy. I don't think what you'd get from Trump is an insistence that the foreign economic policy of every nation, every Western ally, American ally, must mimic America's, and a skilled approach from Canberra will make that clear. There is it's not quite a psychosis, but there is a syndrome in Canberra. It's probably a more helpful syndrome than the opposite, that has convinced itself America thinks about Australian interests. And I think Australia crosses the thinking, enters the mind of American policymakers extraordinarily rarely, often tangentially, and that the relationship is grounded on a kind of vibe more than it's grounded on America taking us seriously. And I probably think that's a good thing. We're a small power, friendly, middling power that can be very helpful to America's geostrategic economic interest in the region, but should not dictate fundamental changes in how America is approaching China. We're a helpful ally rather than one that conditions US thinking. And that, it's good to have that presumption of importance that Canberra has, but it's not real. And I think we probably need to recognize that.
I mean, I asked John Mearsheimer when he was here for a public lecture, publicly, I think it's on YouTube, what should Australia's trading relationship with China be according to your realist take on things? And he said, look, you should just sell them as much stuff as possible, purely press the economic stuff to the floor, while at the same time, getting close and not getting offside with the Americans. I don't know. I mean, I think, he's an academic. He doesn't have that kind of commercial nous. There are limitations to that approach.
Yeah.
Can a self-respecting nation not have a strong industrial sector? And doesn't, as a I think you're still a UK, a Brit citizen, right? The line that you can be part of an economic trading bloc and not be inevitably sort of drawn into ever closer union with that bloc, while you may wish it were the case otherwise, isn't that the inevitable consequence, that the closer you are to in trade, the more you are forced to make political concessions to maintain that trading relationship? And doesn't that pose the conflict? This business that we, like John Howard and others, make, we don't have to choose between China and the United States. At some point levels you do, if because you have to decide in trading relationships who gets particular types of deals.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think that's a great question. It does presume, I think, that trade becomes all-encompassing and starts to dictate the moral or values-driven positions of states like Australia. It seems impossible. I mean, really is impossible in my thinking to imagine that the profound trade relationship we have with China would ever lead to a military alliance with that state. Whereas Australia has a commitment to American values, which is, as we've said, seen it fight in every single war. I mean, literally every single war since the First World War, irrespective of the trade relationship. I think, and this is where my Mearsheimer sympathies start to peter out, and I start seeing ideology, a word we've not really mentioned, as far more important in explaining state behavior than mere, important though they are, but I'll call them mere trade relationships. They don't dictate values. Good illustration of this, of course, is if you go back 110 years, the conflict between the UK and Germany. I mean, in lots of ways, the analog is not perfect, but the trade relationship between Germany and the UK would have suggested an era of peace. And yet, very quickly, for a mixture of ideological, historical, ethnic, personal, dynastic, on and on it goes, reasons, the two states descended into war. So I don't think trade is a cure-all. I don't think trade is deterministic of the decisions states make about their friends.
For good or one way or another. You can be a close. It's just an open question. I mean, I guess to bring it home, the universities in Australia, right? They have massive amounts of Chinese foreign students. Matt Barry, who's the CEO of Freelancer, gave a speech the other day and had lots of interesting statistics. It'll soon go online. But he said there's basically no American students now in Australia. Very, very few, compared to what was the case 20, 30 years ago. And I actually remember, university experience where you had cute Californian girls out, and there seemed to be a lot less of that than there is now on campus. At least that's the impression that I kind of get. And my question is, does that not somehow impact what universities as public institutions, the margins say and do in order to keep the customer happy, the largest customer?
Yes, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that this is a question that we wrestle with in my university and across the sector. I think I dispute whether US, I'd have to check this, but I don't think US numbers are down. It's just that international numbers from every country apart from mainland China seem tiny and static compared to the huge rise in demand we've experienced from the Chinese middle class. But the question you ask is a really good one. By embracing so many students from a proudly communist regime, are we at risk of changing our culture and approach to fit in with the expectations of the Chinese Communist Party? Or are we actually engaged in a subversive mission to subvert the power of the CCP by educating its students in the mores and behaviors of democracy? Now, I want to believe the latter. And when I teach, that's my emphasis. You are now, everyone, we are working within the confines and freedoms of a democratic higher education system, and we will proceed accordingly. And therefore, notions of academic freedom and freedom of speech and the right of association, etc., and protest all apply. My fear is that, and it's not unique to Australia, the fear is we've made accommodations in order to maintain access to that market. But you know, I wrestle with this, but I am comfortable enough in the hope, and sometimes the illustration of the hope, that we are doing more to shift notions of what democracy can do amongst Chinese students than their party handlers are able to shift in terms of our preference for communism. It just, communism is not an easy sell. And education, if you look at this a long answer, if you looked at the collapse of Eastern European communist regimes, what they did well was actually education. Problem with educating 20, 25-year-olds is that you give them a sense of alternative, since there are other options out there. And this is what the Chinese Communist Party will face considerable challenge in trying to contain, that it's now got global citizens who have a notion of living under something other than communism. And that needs to be, that speaks to the West's prospects more than it does to communist China. But I do wrestle with this question.
Yeah, because in theory, it's an incredible opportunity, right? There are students in Australia who could potentially be the next leader of senior leaders of China. So if you had the opportunity, I think I asked this question in an article a while back in the Spectator. I said, imagine you had the opportunity to educate the next leader of China. What would you teach them?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? You do. Well, they're probably in Australia, potentially in Australia. Xi Jinping's daughter studied in Harvard. He sent her abroad.
Yes,
sorry, go on.
That's good, and I remember reading that piece. It's not the other way around, of course. It's not the American, Australian elite sending their 18-year-olds to Beijing and Shanghai. The movement is almost entirely the other way. I mean, ironically, and this takes us into different territory, I think the problem of nationalism as we currently practice it in Australia and America on our campuses actually makes us less able to resist ideological capture. The Chinese, and I teach some very great Chinese students, and one of the commonalities across them is how far, not just for reasons of political survival, but because of genuine conversion, they are strong proponents of China, of Chinese nationalism. They believe in the China experiment or the China dream. We don't have an analog for that in Australia. We teach shame and guilt and reconciliation. There's something suspect about our project. America, again, we've imbibed a lot of this from the cultural Marxism of the American campus, but that cedes territory, I think, to far more assertive ideologies that are strong and capable of reproducing 18-year-olds that believe it. What do our 18-year-olds believe about Australia? I think that's a real problem, and perhaps, I mean, I keep editorializing that we're at peak woke, word I don't like to overuse, but was the voice indicative of a change? That if 60% of people, many of whom will go through our university system, actually don't want a racialized politics, that actually believe Australia is more than the dispossession of Indigenous people, well, I mean, that bodes well, that we are capable of shifting our emphasis, and we've had the 50 years of cultural relativism and self-flagellation perhaps is coming to an end.
Yeah, it's not so much. I understand the point you're making. A Chinese student, or a student indeed from anywhere else, comes to a University of Melbourne, the great University of Melbourne, and there's no real, they imbibe the lifestyle, at least the campus lifestyle, or the greater, Victorian lifestyle and they appreciate sort of the freedoms and what have. But there's no attempt to inculcate them in how great Australia is, or how great the history of it is. Even in a on balance, the good, the bad, we're still it's been a still heroic narrative, was that, I think, the expression John Howard used. There's no at least far less attempt than there would have been 50 years ago, and so it's an symmetrical interaction. You have these students who are from China, let's say, they're far more proud Chinese than they are, revolutionary Marxists. So, the communist label is the name of the party, but it's certainly a different kettle of fish than it was in Mao's time. But they, we're not teaching them God, King, and Country, or we're not teaching them, like I said, and my take was, in that article I wrote quite a while back, is that there's not that much difference between the kind of politics of Harvard Yard and the politics of Tiananmen Square. They're both, you can have a certain, there'll probably be more Palestinian protesters in Harvard Yard, and Tiananmen Square doesn't allow that. But in terms of what they will and won't allow, you can, the interesting thing is where the limits lie. If you were to, anyway, so you have this situation where you have an ostensible, least, liberalism of the university, which engages with harder ideologies, and kind of liberalism isn't enough in and of itself to be able to sort of convert people, because the pull of the nation, or the tribe, or the harder ideology will prevail.
Yes, I think this is the great paradox of liberalism, that it's incapable of defending itself. It's the most attractive feature, I think, in terms of wealth and freedom that liberalism generates in attracting international students to our nation. But when they get here, they realize it's there's a kind of pusillanimity. There's a sense of shame. There's this interesting story I remember going back several years at my university, when we were discussing gifts to give to overseas partners. When we'd visit universities in China and elsewhere, there's a set of gifts, different gifts based on the status of whoever the host is. And it was observed, I think to some consternation, that one of the problems of giving, we had a practice of giving Indigenous gifts to Chinese presidents, vice chancellors, departments. And the reaction was that, why are you giving us gifts from the losers? You displace these people. I mean, not to comment on the rights and wrongs of dispossession, but why are you doing this? And we actually changed and stopped giving Indigenous gifts, because some of our Chinese hosts saw it as an insult. We assume that our unique guilt is generalized. You go to China and they kind of understand. I mean, I think there are some issues with this understanding that they have, but they understand, because of their treatment of Hong Kongers, of Uyghurs, of Tibetans, the absolute necessity for national cohesion. And they
Yeah.
assume Australia is built on the same thing, and they find it's not. It's built on an endless reconciliation of past wrongs that China just does not compute.
Some of the interactions between the modern Australian politic and China and elsewhere can lead to hilarious results. I remember one going to a Taiwanese National Day ceremony here in Queensland, and Brisbane, Queensland has, I think, 70% of the Taiwanese in Australia, and probably about 100% of those live in Sunnybank. But they were, all the different polities were saying, doing the pro forma welcome to acknowledgement of country, and then they would do the acknowledgement of Taiwanese and Chinese leaders, past, present, and emerging. And the Taiwanese guys were coming up to me and asking me in Chinese. It's like, who are they? Who exactly are the ancestors? Are they talking about Confucius? And then it led to a question of, is it like the indigenous people of Taiwan, or are they talking about the mainlanders that have come across? It's just, don't assume that the same type of framework works or can be understood in that way.
We make that acknowledgement so ubiquitously. We've forgotten how absurd it sounds. To foreigners. Every country. I've written about this in previous pieces. Imagine going to Leicestershire, where I'm from, and starting a public event with an apology for how the Normans displaced the Angles. I mean, but that's how it's heard, but by many international students. And I think there's a reckoning. There's a place of reconciliation. Every nation embodies some sense of shame and guilt. I've no problem with that being part of the conversation. But for that to be how we present ourselves to our visitors is a problem, I think, for long-term Australian prospects.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's in the news today. Barrister Lana Kolaris is having a fight with the Bar Association of Victoria about the acknowledgement of country and strength through a hand, in my view. And I'm sure at the university everyone has their own little private battles on these things. But what to sort of finish up, Tim, because I've kept you longer than I expected. What do you think the universities in Australia will look like in 10 years? What should they look like in 10 years?
That's a very, if you're sitting in my position, that's a very big question. As big as in its import is difficult to come to a satisfactory answer. So I think we're reaching. There have always been universities for as long as there has been literacy and thinking. We've formed into collectives that we've called universities. So I think, will universities be here in 100 years? Yes. And in 1,000 years? Yes. Will they be different in 10? Yes, probably. But I'm a conservative by disposition. I don't think we're at the beginning of a fundamental transformation. I do think that we are very prone to fashion and trends, and and it's in the nature of those things that they end and are replaced by new ones. And I think that's where we're at with. We call it cultural Marxism, and I think that term gets overused by its opponents. But we've reached a point where we're not improving things by this ideological overlay, whether it's Indigenous rights or DEI, whatever we call it. And we'll go back to texts. So instead of insisting that students handle objects, we'll actually have them read important things. That means great thinkers and writers like Shakespeare, even Marx, will and Freud and Locke and whoever else your favorite is, they will start to reassert themselves because they've been central to Western culture for hundreds of years and can't be displaced in a fit of new left thinking across the last 50. So my optimism is we're actually on the cusp of a new framing of academic freedom and the pedagogies that occupy our classrooms. Because if we're not, students will cotton on to just how dull identity politics has made the campus. and students don't want to come here to be told they're weak, and they need to be protected from dangerous ideas. I just think it's a denial of basic human truths that we've come to recognize over the millennia that universities have existed. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, it's great. And I think, because I think too, the students, they can get if they want to just pick up the opinion of the day, they can get that elsewhere. But the great texts are hard to learn properly. So you can't just pick up Dante or pick up Locke, but certainly and grasp all that's in it without assistance of people that have devoted their lives to sort of learning it at length. And there's no need for the ideological. You can add a little bit of that. It's an interesting kind of framework for assessing stuff, but it's not it shouldn't be the whole sandwich.
Yes, so I think that's right. Make university hard again. That would be my motto. Because students like challenge. They don't want everything packaged in such a way that it's easy for them. That's the coming shift. It's a psychological counter-revolution in the nature of the undergraduate. That's what there's a good couple of editorials in that. That's where I want to be in 10 years' time.
There's no challenge. There's no achievement. So cool. Really appreciate, and we look forward to those Make University Hard Again caps being wearing those around campus. It was a lovely discussion, Tim. I really appreciate you making time, and look forward to reading more about your commentary in the Australian, elsewhere, or engaging further in due course. Thanks again.
It's been a great pleasure. It's made me think a little differently about some issues, and at my age, I welcome that. Go well.
Okay. Thanks again. Bye.